Good morning. Today we will be presenting the evolution of popular music in the US between 19,000 and 2021. My name is Mahmoud Hassan. Alongside me Mirna Al-Awad and Farah Mabrouk in my group. We shall start with jazz. Jazz. In the 18th century, slaves in the New Orleans area gathered socially at a special market in an area which later became known as Congo Square, famous for its African dances. By 1866, the Atlantic slave trade had brought nearly 400,000 Africans to North America. The slaves were being brought largely from West Africa and the Congo area, and brought strong musical traditions. The African traditions primarily use a single line melody and a call and response pattern, and the rhythms have a counter-metric structure and reflect African speech patterns. The slaves were using a variety of instruments like washboards, washtops, jugs, boxes beaten with sticks or bones, and a drum made by stretching skin over a flour barrel. Another influence that jazz came from was the harmonic style of hymns of the church, which black slaves had learned and incorporated into their own music as spirituals. During the early 19th century, an increasing number of black musicians learned to play European instruments, particularly the violin, which they used to accompany European dance music in their own catwalk dances. From 1920 to 1933, prohibition in the United States banned the sale of alcoholic drinks, resulting in illicit speakeasies, which became lively venues of the jazz age, hosting popular and dance music. Jazz began to gain a wealthy reputation and started getting a huge fan base around the world. In 1919, Kid Ory's original jazz band of musicians from New Orleans began playing in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Then, in 1992, they became the first black jazz band of New Orleans origin to make recordings. Of course, it's known that jazz is happy music, while blues is sad music, but there are also some differences. First of all, jazz is very hard to define, because it has many subgenres. But improvisation is one of its defining elements. The centrality of improvisation is attributed to the influence of earlier forms of music, such as blues. The classical performer goal is to play the composition as it was written. In contrast, jazz is often characterized by the product of interaction and collaboration, placing less value on the contribution of the composer, if there is one, and more on the performer. The jazz performer interprets a tone in individual ways, never playing the same composition twice. Depending on the performer's mood, experience, interaction with band members or audience members, the performer may change melodies, harmonies, and time signatures. Jazz developed further in the 20th century, mostly in the African American communities in the southern United States. Because of the popularity and energy, jazz has been absorbed by other genres as well, including pop, rock, and hip-hop. Freestyle rap, in which the singer improvises lyrics, is the same as the improvisation of jazz musicians. Pop singers as well does perform with jazz musicians. During the 1920s, poets such as T.S. Eliot and Carl Sandburg were writing with less formality and less regard for conventional style. Poetry was evolving at the same time as jazz was increasing in popularity. The two art forms took note of each other's style and came together to form jazz poetry, which not only contained literal references to jazz, but mimicked the style of music as well. Flappers used jazz as a means of rebelling against society. And since jazz is such a danceable music, the clothing needed to match as well. The pre-war Victorian style clothing was not really compatible with dancing. So the evolution of jazz led to the change in the fashion industry as well. First, the drop waist was introduced, and then came dresses with no waistline at all. Not only clothes, but also hairstyles were affected. The pop style grew increasingly more popular than long hair, because just as looser fitting clothes were needed, dancing with shorter hair was also easier. Over time, social struggles regarding racial segregation began to relax in the US. White band leaders began to recruit black musicians, and black band leaders were recruiting white musicians as well. Female jazz performers and composers have contributed to the genre throughout its history. We have Betty Carter, Ella Fitzgerald, and Billie Holiday, famous for their vocal talents, pianist Lil Hardin Armstrong, and songwriter Dorothy Field. When male jazz musicians were drafted during World War II, many female bands replaced them. The International Sweethearts of Rhythm, which was founded in 1937, was a popular band that became the first female band in the US history, and the first to travel with the USO, touring Europe in 1945.
When you're feeling low and you don't know what to do. When you're feeling low and you don't know what to do. Just stay in the groove, let nothing bother you. I may be small, but baby, have no fear. I may be small, but baby, have no fear.
In New Orleans jazz, performers took turns playing melodies and improvising counter melodies. In the swing era of the 1920s to the 1940s, big bands relied more on arrangements which were written or learned by ear or memorized. Swing music name came from the emphasis of the offbeat or weaker pulse. Swing bands usually featured soloists who would improvise on the melody over the arrangement. The danceable swing style of big bands and band leaders such as Benny Goodman was the dominant form of American popular music from 1935 to 1946, known as the swing era. During the same period, Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald enjoyed a degree of crossover success that very few jazz vocalists could match. For more than a decade, this appealing brand of swing jazz was the most popular music in America. Bebop is a style of jazz developed in the early 1940s in the US, which features compositions characterized by fast tempo, complex chord progressions, with rapid chord changes and numerous changes of key. The idea of bebop is that it contains a style of lightning fast improvisation, which is meant for serious listeners. Two of the most famous beboppers of the time were Miles Davis and Charlie Parker. After the rise of bebop, jazz splintered into competing camps. In the 1950s, a more melodic style known as cool jazz gained widespread popularity, pioneered by Miles Davis, Stan Getz, and Chet Baker. Miles Davis set off the next wave of innovation with his rock-oriented Bitches Brew album from the 1970s. Plugged-in guitars and keyboards now moved to the forefront of the genre. Country music. Country music originated in the early 20th century among working class Americans living in the South. It was influenced by jazz and blues. Country music was a broad musical tradition. As it became more popular, it grew to include other regional genres, including western swing, honky-tonk, country boogie, and rockabilly. Historians acknowledge that country music is derived from a melting pot of cultures. Mountain or hillbilly music in particular combines the ballads and the folk music brought to the South by immigrants from the British Isles in the 18th and 19th century, and the rhythmic influences of American immigrants. an instrumentation and form often distinguished country music from other traditions. In general, string instruments like banjos, acoustic and electric guitars, dobros, fiddles, and harmonicas accompanied simple harmonies with rhythmic precision. The earliest country musicians rejected drums, believing that they were too brash and loud. By the mid-1930s, however, Western swing musicians such as band leader Bob Wills added drums. Political changes, along with new musical styles, were on the horizon by the 1950s. Rock and roll began to influence country music, encouraging some artists to incorporate its stylistic elements into a form called rockabilly. In the 1960s, progressive artists began a folk revival, writing protest songs in response to social and political turmoil. Most country music artists understood that their audiences were culturally conservative. However, so many largely avoided progressive politics. For nearly a century, country music has remained a power horse because of its ability to adapt. In the 1970s, country pop was named for the country songs that broke top 40 radio, and country rock, created as a return to old rock and roll, both were able to reshape country music. Country pop emerged with hits by musicians like Kenny Rogers and Glen Campbell, while country rock acts included the Marshall Tucker Band, the Allman Brothers, and the Eagles. Country origins were lost in the early decades of colonization. When the folk dances and the British ballad got transplanted into the New World and got contaminated by the religious hymns of church and camp meetings. The music styles were reminiscent of their British ancestors. The lyrics, on the other hand, were completely different. The Americans disliked the subject of love, to which they preferred practical issues, such as real-world experiences, like ranching, logging, mining, and railroads, and real-world tragedies. Country music had a profound impact on the American subconscious. It provided the American nation with an identity.
Everybody says you're the man, the final piece to my master plan. You got my world in the palm of your hand.
Rock and roll. The immediate roots of rock and roll lay in the rhythm and blues and country music of the 1940s and 1950s. Particularly significant influences were jazz, blues, gospel, country, and folk music. In the 1930s, jazz and particularly swing were among the first music to present African American sounds for a predominantly white audience. One particularly noteworthy example of a jazz song with recognizably rock and roll elements is Big Joe Turner with pianist Pete Johnson in their single Rollin' Pete, which is regarded as an important precursor of rock and roll.
Get out of that kitchen, baby, wash your face and hands. Get out of that kitchen, baby, wash your face and hands. Wear your big smile, stop, because I'm such a hungry mess.
During and immediately after World War II, with shortages of fuel and limitations on audiences and developer personnel, large jazz bands were less economical and tended to be replaced by smaller combos using guitars, bass, and drums. Chuck Berry developed his brand of rock and roll by transposing the familiar two-note lead line of drum blues piano directly to the electric guitar, creating what is instantly known as rock guitar. Similarly, country boogie and Chicago electric blues supplied many of the elements that would be seen as characteristics of rock and roll. Rock and roll arrived at a time of technological changes, soon after the development of electric guitar, amplifier, and microphone. There were also changes in the record industry, with the rise of independent labels like Atlantic, Sun, and Chess serving niche audiences, with a similar rise of radio stations that played their music. It was the realization that white teenagers were listening to this music that led to the development of what was to be defined as rock and roll as a distinct genre. Because of the development of rock and roll was an evolutionary process, no single record can be identified as ambiguously the first rock and roll record. Contenders for the title include Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Strange Things Happening Every Day in 1944, That's Alright by Arthur Crudup, The Fat Man by Fats Domino, 1949. Other artists that had many rock and roll hits included Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, and Little Richard. Chuck Berry's 1995 classic Maybelline has a very particular features that included distorted electric guitar with warm overtones created by his small valve amplifier. The popularization of rock and roll involved both black performers reaching to white audience and white musicians reaching to black audience. Rock and roll appeared at a time when racial tensions in the United States were entering a new phase, with the beginning of the civil rights movement for desegregation. Many authors have argued that early rock and roll was vital in the way both white and black teenagers identified themselves. Rock and roll was the only form of music that was specifically addressed to teenagers. There had been many records for adults and kids, but nothing for the age in between. Rock and roll filled this gap. Also, rock and roll enabled Norman Americans the opportunity to express themselves freely. Not using R&B and country music, but using music that was tailored for freedom and life. The young life that was demanded by rock and roll was a concern for older generations, who worried about having kids with social rebellion. Particularly because to a large extent, rock and roll culture was shared by different racial and social groups. From 1950s to 1960s, rock and roll advocated for new dances, including the twist. Teenagers found the syncopated backbeat rhythm especially suited for jitterbug dancing. School and church gym dances and home basement dancing parties became the new thing. American teens watched Dick Clark's American Bandstand to keep up on the latest dance and fashion styles. Rockabilly refers to the type of rock and roll music which was played and recorded in the 1950s, primarily by white singers such as Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis, who drew mainly on the country roots of the music. The defining features of the rockabilly sound included strong rhythms, vocal twangs, and common use of tape echo. Many other popular rock and roll singers of the time, such as Fats Domino and Little Richard, came out of the R&B tradition, making the music attractive to wide audiences and are not usually classified under rockabilly. Rockin' Around the Clock by Bill Haley became one of the biggest hits in history. It was considered that one song that introduced the music to a global audience, as it was a breakthrough for all the rock and roll music.
Join me home, we'll have some fun when the clock strikes one. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. We're gonna rock, rock, rock till broad daylight. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight.
Psychedelic rock, also referred to as psychedelia, is a diverse style of rock music inspired by psychedelic culture, which is centered around hallucinogenic drugs. Originating in the mid-1960s among British and American musicians, the music is intended to replicate and enhance the mind-altering experiences of psychedelic drugs, most notably LSD. Many psychedelic groups differ in style, and the label is often applied generally. The sound of psychedelic rock invokes three core effects of LSD: depersonalization, dechronicization, and dynamization, all of which detach the user from reality. These effects may be represented by novelty studio tricks, electronic or non-Western instrumentation, disjunctive song structures, and extended instrumental segments. There are many psychedelic rock artists, Three of the most notable are Pink Floyd, the Beatles, and Jefferson Airplane. Progressive rock is a broad genre of rock music that developed in the 1960s. Initially termed progressive pop, the style of an outgrowth psychedelic bands who abandoned standard pop traditions in favor of instrumentation and compositional techniques, more frequently associated with jazz, folk, or classical music. There are additional elements that contributed to its progressive label. Lyrics were more poetic. Technology was harnessed for new sounds. Music approached the condition of art, and the studio rather than the stage became the focus of musical activity, which often involves creating music for listening rather than dancing. Two of the most famous progressive rock artists were Pink Floyd and Genesis.
The path is clear, though no eyes can see. The course laid down long before.
Heavy metal is a genre of rock music that developed in the late 1960s and early 1970s, largely in the US and in the UK, with roots in blues, rock, psychedelic rock, and also acid rock. Heavy metal bands developed the thick, massive sound characterized by distortion, extended guitar solos, and emphatic beats and loudness. The lyrics and performances are sometimes associated with aggression and violence. Two famous heavy metal bands were Iron Maiden and Aerosmith. Hip-hop. Hip-hop first emerged in the 1970s. It was born when an 18-year-old Jamaican-born DJ, Kool Herc, began rapping over a looped instrumental in one of the African-American block parties that were thrown in the Bronx neighborhoods. Hip-hop was meant for providing a voice for those underrepresented in the society. And back then, those were the African Americans. But now, it involves everyone. It was meant to comment on social and political issues with their society. African Americans were known to be depressed at that time, and that was the only form of art that they knew how to express their emotions and concerned with creatively. However, its early evolution came when sampling technology and drums were first available and affordable. In the 1980s, hip-hop world welcomed a variety of artists including whites and Latinos, which counted as a major breakthrough. Examples include Eminem, Jay-Z, Wu-Tang Clan, Missy Elliott, and De La Soul. Hip-hop's origin is affected by the spoken word, samples, and borrowed beats, the accents, subcultures, and mannerisms. Not all of the US had welcomed the hip-hop world just yet, and they varied from each other as well. In the 1990s in Houston, it was leaning more towards funk and soul music. It included heavy bass sounds borrowed from Miami. Detroit's hip-hop, for example, was more influenced by the techno scene. Chicago's hip-hop was made relative to party, and that was most known because of Kanye West popularizing it.
Get my money. I had a dream I could buy my way to heaven. When I woke, I spent that on a necklace. I told God I'll be back in a second. Man, it's so hard not to act reckless. To whom much is given, much is tested. Get arrested, guess until he get the message.
Hip-hop is not only a genre of music, but it's also a culture. It allows artists and the youth to create art that reflects the reality of their lives, of the neighborhoods around them, and of the wider social circumstances in which they found themselves in. Till this day, it did not fail to become popular and trendy. In fact, it is what this generation listens to mostly as a genre, memorizing word by word while expressing themselves through it. EDM first began in the late 1970s and early 1980s. It came from the disco genre. EDM is electronic dance music aimed at the crowd to get onto the dance floor. It includes disco music, synth pop, techno, house music, trance music, drum and bass, dubstep, trap, hardstyle, and more. It can be said that EDM didn't sound the same during the 70s, the 80s, 90s, or even 2000s. Up till now, it has only been evolving.
Lady, hear me tonight, 'cause my feeling is just so right as we dance by the moonlight.
Today, EDM's many subgenres are heard all over the world, from nightclubs to DJ contests to mega music festivals. Constantly evolving technology contributes to new, creative takes year after year. Electronic music has evolved into its own culture of clothing and fashion, visual art and flow art, and the hypnotic performance art of human movement. In the fashion world, fashion shows throughout the US are featuring EDM at their showcase. There are many famous EDM artists all over the world. Some of them are David Guetta, Tiesto, and Martin Garrix.
All the crazy shit I did tonight, those will be the best memories. I just wanna let it go for the night. That would be the best therapy for me.
In conclusion, the evolution of music in the US was massive in all genres. It did not just affect the US, it affected the whole world. These genres are being listened to in every corner of the world. These great musicians shaped the whole world. Many young musicians are following their footsteps to influence the world as they did.